special day in so many ways. I gave my life to Christ at the age of 20, living in Dallas, Texas. 6 months later, I was at Harding University, and the reason I went there was I'd been raised by believing parents, but I had gone into quite a considerable time of agnosticism in my life. And when it came to kind of a spiritual crisis that came to a head and I gave my life to Christ, I wanted to kind of catch up on all the things that I had lost by tuning out my spiritual life. And there weren't a lot of choices in those days. I was a junior at North Texas State University and didn't want to change majors. In fact, I had enough of at that point, I'd had enough of liberal arts education. I just wanted to dive heavily into the Word. And I looked around. There were basically schools of preaching. Bible colleges really weren't very extant at that time. And I looked around at Preston Road, Brown Trail, a lot of them ended up at Harding because the faculty there was shared by university faculty was shared by the School of Biblical Studies, which was called the Christian Communication Program when I enrolled. I was the youngest student they had up to that point. Just turned 21 years old, which was the minimum age to go there. I was the only single one. Everyone else, all the other men that were there, about 15 of us in the class, and most of them were in their 30s and 40s, had families, and I didn't. And so I wasn't interested in being a preacher. I went there to learn the Bible. I just wanted 2 years of total submersion in Scripture and related things. And I didn't look like a preacher student. Drove a 67 Mustang with a 427 engine, played Gibson Les Paul and Slingerland drums, and just they called me the unpreacher in my class, because I just didn't have the profile. And as I've shared with you before, I really wasn't interested in that line of work. I would tell everybody I'm allergic to polyester. I could never be a preacher. I was in a class, as I said, about 15, and two in that class, actually, Roy and his wife, Margaret Ramsey, had two children, Michelle and Jimmy Wayne. They were from Fort Gibson, Oklahoma. They both grew up there. Roy had been a farmer. Margaret was the daughter of a farmer. And Roy had decided, he was in his 30s, and decided that he wanted to get into the ministry. So he was in the same class, and we met at Harding in that same Delta class of the Christian Communication Program. Roy later became a missionary to Africa and preached when he came back, Haskell for a while, and now lives currently in Shakota. Some of you know Roy and Margaret Ramsey. In that program, on the second year, it's a 2-year program, in the second year, students had to be actively working with a congregation. It was part of kind of on-the-job training. And the beginning of summer, starting our second year, a couple of the students in the class ahead of us came to Roy and asked Roy, they were preaching at a place called Pennington, Arkansas, about 50 miles north of Searcy. And they would drive up there twice a week, drive up there on Sundays and teach and preach, and then go back on Wednesday night, etc. And they asked Roy if he would take over for them because they were graduating, going to other places. And Roy came to me and asked if I would share that responsibility with him, which I did. And Pennington was a congregation about 70 to 100 members. They couldn't afford full-time ministers, so they would use students from Harding, and I was one of those. And while there, I met Willis and Dora Evans. And they became my surrogate family. They adopted me. I was flat broke. I would come out, had a 65 Volkswagen Beetle that I drove, that you had to tie the hood down because it had been in a wreck and it wouldn't close. And so every time I would have to get gas, I would have to untie because the gas tank's in the front and lift that up. And so I was flat broke. And I would come out after a Sunday night, and there would be a J.C. Penney's bag in the passenger seat with 2 shirts in and it took me a while to learn, but Dora Evans, who is Charlotte's mother, was behind that. I became the son they never had. I became the daughter that they wished they had. And in fact, when Charlotte was away, this began at the beginning of summer. By the end of summer, I was absolutely in love with them. She had an older brother who was married and had moved away, and she had a younger brother, Philip, who was still in the home. He was a senior at that time. He and I became just fast friends. One of the greatest people I know to this day, Philip Evans. So I fell in love with her family, and they were showing me partiality of all kinds. Her dad was an elder there, and we just cut from the same cloth. I knew they had a daughter. There were some pictures of Charlotte in the home, but they didn't do her justice. And she had been away from the summer, so she was in Florida visiting a friend for the summer and came back. She was a school teacher, taught in Weiner, Arkansas, lived in Jonesboro, which is about another 40, 50 miles from Pennington. And so at the end of summer, she came back, and she was, her mom had called her and said, you gotta come, we've got the cutest little preacher. And Charlotte hated me from the beginning because I had displaced her. That they just, they just really took me in, and it was a great experience. And they, like I say, they became my surrogate parents. In the fall, Roy Ramsey was asked to accompany, he was asked by a congregation there in Searcy if he would work with them. So it just became myself preaching there at the, in the church there at Pennington. And as I say, that's where we met, that's where we were married, etc. Now, in the fall, my first fall there, and when Charlotte had come back, Roy asked me and Charlotte if we would accompany him to a retreat at Burnt Cabin Camp. And it was a fall retreat. It was over Thanksgiving weekend. And he invited us to come. And I don't know if he had designs on us. He never pushed, never suggested anything. But he did ask us to come and be counselors at that retreat. And that's where I met Don Branscombe at Burnt Cabin. Now, when I was growing up, I got sent to some camps in Texas, and one of them was Deer Run. Deer Run it was an amazing place. I mean, it had a huge lake, you could canoe, they had boats, horseback riding, all the things that you kind of think in traditional, like scout camps, archery, whatever you wanted to do. And then I came to Burnt Cabin. And when we first drove up there, I was incredibly underwhelmed. And because it looked like post-apocalyptic America to me. The newest building was old at the time. There was no retreat center. They still had, right at the beginning, they were, had, those of you who know, were the old, I want to call it a cafeteria, because I get, the military terms. You have a mess hall, you have a latrine, you have barracks, bunkhouses. But that first several days, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, incredibly overwhelmed by the spiritual fervor of the place. Don Branscombe, who was leading Fort Gibson's Teen Week and Junior Week, he was the one that put together that retreat, did it every year, just as a kind of a layover between Teen Weeks. And got to meet Don Branscombe. We immediately became great buddies and appreciated his vision. And I cannot begin to tell you, and if you've been there, you've experienced it. I've said so often about Burnt Cabin that never have so many done so much with so little. And I think, as I think back on my past, I think the greatest gift that Burnt Cabin had was a lack of material. It was a lack of opportunities, because what it meant was you had to depend on the people. You didn't go there for horseback riding. You didn't go there for canoeing. You didn't go there for arts and crafts. You didn't go there to ride home, hello mudda, hello fada. You went there because of the spiritual intensity. Donnie asked us that week if we would come back for Teen Week the next year, Fort Gibson's Teen Week, and we did. And that fall retreat was really the beginning of Charlotte and me spending time together. So obviously that has a special place in our hearts. But guys, we would sleep in a bunkhouse. Some of you remember those. They were actually barracks. And at the end of the room, you had 2 rooms, and at the end there was a big exhaust fan. And the idea of the exhaust fan was to recreate the Sahara. Because the hot air would come, it was all screens on both sides, and the hot air would come blow over you, and then it got exhausted, and by that time it became cooler air. We would all have fans. You would sleep with your head toward the screen. And we all had fans in the window, and it would get so hot sometimes that the breaker would blow. In the middle of the night, somebody would yell out, "Breaker!" And the poor guy by the breaker panel had to hit the breaker again. I mean, it was just overload. Guys, the camp had a centralized breaker for the bunkhouses. And sometimes you'd hear in the middle of the night, but generally in the morning when the girls were getting ready, because they had blow dryers, curling irons, and now the whole half of the camp shut down. And you'd yell out, "Breaker!" Somebody had to trek down the hill to a pole that had a box, and you had to throw that main breaker. And it got to where we had weeks where there were 220, 230 teens coming. And one year, and it was particularly very hot. And I'm telling you, it was so hot that at night when it was time to go to bed, lights out, you would go into the shower in cold, get up in your bunk with your fan blowing on you, hoping you could fall asleep before you dried out. Because that's the only thing that could cool you. And you think I'm kidding, I'm not. And to have to do that 3 or 4 times because you just about nodded off and then you got hot. So you had to go back and do it again and again. One year, Don Branscombe said, "No more hair dryers, no more curling irons. We're going to burn this camp down." That was the year we all got real. The next year, it was a girl. I will never forget this. Charlie Cook, who was a deacon in a church in Muskogee, had a daughter, cute girl, but she was very fastidious. She brought the next year a butane curling iron. Never have so many done so much with so little. 200 plus. We had kids sleeping on ping pong tables. We had them sleeping under anywhere that you could find somebody, because the capacity of the camp at the time was, I think, like 140. The singing was amazing. Church every night. And it wasn't that it was mandatory, which it was a focal point. And every night after the sermon, there would be 20 or 30 young people come forward rededicating their lives. 20 to 30 to 40 would be baptized every year. So often at night, us counselors, we would be having Bible studies every night. I remember a 12-year-old girl We're having a Bible study on a Friday night. Now on Saturday we leave, 12 years old. And I had this interview process because kids that young, you want to make sure they know what they're doing. And so I might ask questions like, what would happen if you waited a year? And if they say, well, I'd be all right, then I know they're not ready. And so I'm asking her questions, and she's answering them, because the thing is, kids know the answers. They've learned the answers, but have they internalized the knowledge? And so I had asked her, and after a while she said, Mr. Parker, can I ask you a question? Yes. Are you going to baptize me, or do I need to find somebody else? Let's go. Let's go. There was a year that we went with Fort Gibson, had 2 weeks. The kids were saying 1 week's not enough. We need 2 weeks. And I'm going to tell you why. They experienced the greatest foretaste of heaven that they ever saw on earth. This was, folks, totally dedicated all week long. Totally on a spiritual high. The singing was amazing. The prayers were amazing. The devos were amazing. And they couldn't get enough. And they were saying, because it would take till like Tuesday or Wednesday before the mask of the world started coming off and getting real with one another. And you know what? The week that Donnie said no hair dryers and no curling irons, it was one of the greatest weeks because it was everybody being real. No masks, no fakes, just being who we are and loving each other for it. It was a year that, it was about that time that on Friday you always had the softball championship, volleyball championship, and the camp came to the directors, and I was co-directing with Donnie the teen week, and the teens came to us and said, we don't want to have more sports. We don't want to have the championship games, which was a big deal. We want to continue the study we've been on this week because we're going home tomorrow. So we did. We just did without the sports. And that afternoon, 3+ hours of study in the Word. That kind of fervor. And I'd never seen that before anywhere. And the great thing about seeing that is for years, and guys, ever since those days, I've run into people, sometimes at a mall in Tulsa or Oklahoma City or whatever, and they would say, Steve. And I would say, hi. You don't remember me, do you? No, you're going to have to help me. I was so-and-so at camp. Oh, yeah, you're the one I had to make run up and down the hill because you wouldn't go to sleep. I want to tell you what that camp meant to me. I want to tell you how it kept my spirit alive. Guys, I want to tell you about the nights on Friday nights when you're with a camper in tears because they're going home to what they believed was a dead congregation, wondering how am I going to keep my fervor for Christ alive. Kids in tears telling you, there are folks at home with buckets of cold water who just want to drench what I've experienced. How do I keep it alive? Your heart just aches. But what it reflects is they saw what heaven is going to look like. For a week, we got them away from the world. No phones, no anything from the world. For a week, they got to experience total positive spiritual influence, not negative, destructive world influence. And as I mentioned, sometimes it would take till Wednesday before the masks would come off because the world was so much with them. And then they hated going home. They didn't want to leave. And that's why we went to 2 weeks. Never have so many done so much with so little. I want to thank you for your role in creating such a place. A Garden of Eden in which our children, but not just our children, children from all over can get a foretaste of what heaven's going to be like. I want to thank the leaders and former elders of this congregation who have carried that burden for years and years and years. How many, as Sam prayed, how many tens of thousands of souls have you impacted by being a major part of Burnt Cabin? How many are going to be in heaven because of Burnt Cabin? How many are going to go to hell without its influence? I want to thank Sam and Joyce. God led you guys to us, and your fingerprint on Burnt Cabin is to be greatly praised. Your sacrifice has not gone unnoticed. I want to thank Don and Lydia. God led you to us. Your fingerprint, likewise, on Burnt Cabin is to be greatly praised. And all of that will be obvious to us this afternoon when we go. Your sacrifice has not been unnoticed. Psalm 19:9, or 119:9. How can a young man keep his way pure? By keeping it according to thy word. In Mark 10, verse 13 through 15, folks were bringing their children so that Jesus could lay his hands on them and bless them. And his followers, the grown-ups, the mature ones, were prohibiting them because they're involved in adult world. They're involved in reality, and the kids get in the way. And unfortunately, that's been the attitude towards children. I was raised in a time where the phrase was, children are to be seen and not heard. Children are easily abused. They can be taken for granted. And Jesus used them as an example. If you don't become like this, he said, you're not going to make it to heaven, this being the child. But as they were bringing their kids, and as the kids were running up to Jesus, his disciples tried to stop them. Jesus made a very interesting statement. In the King James translation, it says, suffer the children to come to me. Suffer the children to come to me. Because if you don't become like them, you're not going to see the kingdom. In other words, they're closer to me than you are. Suffer them to come. Now, in the modern translations, it's going to say, allow them to come. And I did some study on that. Why is it translated suffer in the King James? And how has suffer changed its meaning? Because in 1611, suffer did mean to allow, permit. But how has suffer changed its meaning from allowing or permitting to bearing a burden, of hurting? And if you go back to the root of the word, what it literally means is to lift up, to raise up. And when you do that, that's a burden. So the King James translation, although the words don't make a lot of sense, the translation does. Bear up these children at your cost. Bear up these children at your suffering, at your sacrifice. Bear them up. Bring them to me. It's not just tolerate, encourage, lift it. Bear that burden. And today we've been given opportunity to once again bear that burden, if you will, to suffer that they come. If you will, to take our resources that we would use in some other way, very possibly for our own end, and to sacrifice it, to suffer by giving it, and learning the joy that only comes through sacrifice. And the more that hurts, the greater the lesson. Because everything that we are and have came through sacrifice. And the only thing worth having come through sacrifice. if you didn't have the opportunity to share in that, if you didn't have the opportunity to suffer the children, please do. Please do, because what that camp has done, churches throughout the United States can never be replaced. What it continues to do. Guys, if you ever think of Feed the Children or St. Jude's Hospital, think about the souls of children, not just their medical needs or their physical needs. And I want you to understand, let's take just a second and stop and think, as being a part of that ministry and as being a part of Riverhawks, we're investing children all the way down to childhood, all the way through university. We're bearing children. We are suffering for a cause that is greater than anything else we can do financially. And that's investing in our children. But not just our children. Children that are sent to that place from all over the place, whose lives are changed forever, whose eternity is changed forever. Don't ever take it for granted because it's nearby. Don't ever take it for granted because we have a long history with it. Guys, Christian camps in many places are in trouble because of the times in which we live. Whatever we take for granted, we can end up losing. And we have in our neighborhood a tremendous opportunity to suffer the children. The song that we sang, how shall the young secure their hearts and guard their lives? And I'm telling you, one of the greatest answers we have to that question, Burnt Cabin Youth Camp. And every life in this room has been touched by it one way or the other. What a privilege to suffer the children. If you didn't this morning, please go back home, reconsider. Please look at your budget. Please look at your income. Please look at your expenditures. Please make the commitment. Today, I will suffer the children. Come, Christ. What a great opportunity. What a great mission to be involved. Brothers and sisters, that mission to so many lives begins at Burnt Cabin. But it continues. How is your walk now? Those of you who got spiritual shots in the arm by attending Burnt Cabin, those of you who are baptized out there, those who are baptized in the pool, or even beyond that, going back to the lake, how are you doing now? What a great start. But what a tragedy to start well and not end up well. How is your walk today? Can we help you with that? Let's talk. Come as we stand and sing, will you?